Presenting data is a scientific and fact-based endeavor, right? The facts are the facts and you just present them as they are and nothing can go wrong, right? Well, the book Storytelling with Data would tell you that that is not correct. Instead, the very first chapter of the book is called The Importance of Context. Instead of being ruled by immutable facts, presenting data is a form of communication like any other presentation. Every communicated sentence has a different meaning depending on who says it, in what tone, and to whom. Interpreted and presented data is very similar to that. So before you get started with your presentation, before you even open your PowerPoint or Keynote software, the book urges you to consider the context of your presentation and what actions should follow after you performed it. Context is a very general word, so let's look at some specific parts of the context that you should consider before starting. First, there's of course the content of your presentation, the data that you're presenting, right? If you have been working with the data for a few days or even weeks, you'll be very familiar with it. You probably have done a lot of exploration in the dataset. You might have tested up to 100 different hypotheses and found out which of those are true. Now, while it might be tempting to present all of the work you did, and I've certainly done that before, it is more important that you present the most interesting aspects that you find in the data. Save the audience some time. They don't want to go through the work that you did, especially if you present to a manager or a higher up. They hired you to do the work. They just want to know the results and not everything you did to get there. So I told you to pick the most one or two interesting aspects of the data, right? But what does interesting mean? Well, that again depends on the context, specifically on your audience. Right at the start, you should identify who exactly your audience is and avoid being too general. Don't just say stakeholders. Identify, if needed, the precise decision maker within your audience. And then if you've done that, also consider how this person perceives you. Are you already a long working team? Have you already worked together and they trust your judgment on what you're doing? Or is this a first impression? Are you already seen as an expert in your field, or are you just a newcomer, so to say, and you have to prove your credibility on the source data? All of these aspects are important and will influence how much detail and what kind of detail you include in your presentation. The next tip is something that I have not previously thought about and that was very interesting to me, and that is asking yourself the question, what do you want your audience to do? You might think you're only there to report the facts and leave the decision to the higher ups. But the book Storytelling with Data instead tells you to give a recommendation for action whenever possible. The key idea here is to make the presentation relevant for your audience. The worst thing that can happen after a presentation is that your audience says, "So what?" and just moves on with their day. You need to make it clear why they should care and why this data is relevant to them. Even if your recommended action is not what they end up going with in the end, presenting it at the end of your presentation will spark a conversation around taking action. Now, taking action doesn't always have to mean something drastic as approving a budget or making changes to policy. It could simply mean that the decision makers remember the data that you just presented going into the next business quarter or making future plans. The next piece of context around your presentation is how will you actually communicate with the audience? The default nowadays is to just create a slide set, but even when you decided on doing that, you need to consider how much detail you put into the presentation. And that highly depends on if you are there to give the presentation live and you see reactions from your audience, or maybe the talk will be recorded. Or another thing might be that you simply intend to give the written slides to someone else who will not actually hear you speak about them. The book states that there is an inverse correlation between the amount of control that you have on your presentation and the amount of detail you need to include beforehand. So consider this. In a live presentation, you are there and you can see your audience and see if they are maybe confused, if they get distracted. You can respond to cues that might tell you to speed up or slow down at specific points. And you are there to answer any clarifying questions that your audience might have. And because you are there to respond to the questions, you don't need to have everything or every possible answer already written down. If your talk is instead recorded, you might need to think about what possible questions the audience has and how to implement them into your presentation. But because you are talking at the same time, you shouldn't put all of the details on the slides. Instead, you should consider what to say verbally and what to present on the slide itself, so you're not distracting your audience with two different things at the same time. A lot of this changes if you have even less control because you are not there to talk about the slides, not even in a recorded format, and instead you're just handing off your slides or your document to someone else to read. In that case, you need to put even more detail in written or graph form into this document. And for these reasons, it should be at all avoided to create something that the author of the book called a slideument, which are slides that are also a document, which means that you made the slides for a presentation and then you just give them to someone else afterwards who will not hear you talk about this. This will either mean that you put too much information on the slides, which will probably distract your live audience, or too little information for the person that doesn't hear you talk about the slides to properly understand them. So that's all the tips that I have learned from the first chapter of Storytelling with Data. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!